Okay, all right. So I'm on Team Warfare. We're here today, and I'm going to go over a topic about zeal not according to knowledge, or the difference between godly zeal and ungodly zeal. Uh, so I've got a few things kind of gathered together in one place. I'm going to go over, and I'm going to start with a text by Saint Nectarios of Aegina. And he says, "The zealot, according to knowledge, motivated by the love of God and his neighbor, does all things with love and self effacement. He does nothing that might bring sorrow to his neighbor. Such a zealot is enlightened by knowledge, and nothing prompts him to deviate from what is morally right. The Christian who is inspired by zeal not according to knowledge is a ruinous man, who turns the gospel of grace and love upside down. His zeal is a seductive fire, a consuming fire. Destruction comes forth from him, and desolation follows in his wake. He beseeches God to send down fire from heaven and to devour all those who do not embrace his principles and convictions. He is characterized by hatred for those of other religions and confessions, envy and persistent anger, violent resistance to the true spirit of divine law, and unreasonable obstinacy in defending his own views, a passionate zeal for prevailing in all things, the love of glory, quarrels, contention, and a love of turmoil." Okay, so I guess the point that I'm trying to get out about this is, like, oftentimes we'll see within true Orthodoxy, and it's not only in true Orthodoxy, you'll see World Orthodox people do this too, is that they'll think that since they've gotten the truth or they know the truth, then they can kind of view other people as stupid, or just kind of puffed up about what they know. And I think the gospel kind of talks about this as like, when the Jays would see themselves as righteous because they had received the law, whereas the law was meant for the Jays to correct themselves. They seen it as a way that they were better than everybody else because they got the law, and that wasn't the purpose of it. And if we read in Matthew 7:14, it says, "Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way that leads to life, and there are few who find it." Um, and there's a talk about the royal path. So there's the path on the left and the path on the right. And if we're to take the narrow path, we can't fall into extremes on either side of those, of the true path that we're supposed to go down as Christians. And there's a few things that, from the letters of Father Seraphim Rose where he talks about this. And what he says is the royal path to true orthodoxy. I've done an episode on the royal path in the past. It says the royal path of true orthodoxy today is a mean that lies between the extremes of ecumenism and reformism on one side, and a quote zeal not according to knowledge, which is Romans 10:2, on the other. True orthodoxy does not go quote in step with the times on the one hand, nor does it make quote strictness or correctness or canonicity good in themselves an excuse for pharisaic self-satisfaction, exclusivism, and distrust on the other. This true orthodox moderation is not to be confused with mere lukewarmness or indifference, or with any kind of compromise between political extremes. The spirit of, quote, reform is so much in the air today that anyone whose views are molded by the, quote, spirit of the times will regard true Orthodox moderation as close to, quote, fanaticism. But anyone who looks at the question more deeply and applies the patristic standard will find the royal path to be far from any kind of extremism. Perhaps no Orthodox teacher in our own days provides such an example of sound and fervent Orthodox moderation as the late Archbishop of Verkey of Jordanville. His numerous articles and sermons breathe the refreshing spirit of true Orthodox zealotry, without any deviation either to the quote right or to the left, and with emphasis constantly on the spiritual side of true Orthodoxy. And so I gathered two kind of quotes that kind of sum up Archbishop Verkey's view on this, I think. And I'm going to read those quickly, and then I'm going to actually go to maybe another topic. Uh, but this is what Archbishop Verkey said. So he said, true Orthodoxy is alien to every dead formalism. In it, there is no blind adherence to the letter of the law, for it is spirit and life. That's St. John 6:63. Where from an external and purely formal point of view, everything seems quite correct and strictly legal. This does not mean that it is so in reality. Orthodoxy is one and only truth, the pure truth, without any mixture or the least shadow of falsehood, lie, evil, or fraud. Um, and the real reason I'm bringing up this topic has to deal with this next quote from Archbishop of Verkey, where he says, "And there's likewise a false lying zeal behind the mask which is concealed the foaming of ordinary human passions, most frequently pride, the love of power and honor, the interests of party politics, like that which plays the leading role in political struggles, and for which there can be no place in spiritual life, in public church life, but which unfortunately is often being encountered in our time and is the chief instigator of every imaginable quarrel and disturbance in the church, the managers and instigators of which often hide themselves behind some kind of supposed idealism, but reality pursue only their own personal aims, striving to please not God but their own self-concern, and being zealous not for God's glory, but for their own glory, and the glory of the colleagues and partisans of their party. All of this, it goes without saying, is profoundly foreign to true holy zeal, hostile to it, and it is sinful and criminal, for it only compromises our holy faith and the church." So, I guess my point in bringing this up is that oftentimes when we're dealing with certain people within jurisdictions of Orthodoxy, especially true Orthodoxy, I've found that they'll look for any little detail in Orthodox history, like be it like the canons or a quote from a saint, and they use these types of things to crush anybody that isn't in their party. And they take these things out of context, and they're not following the spirit of God, and they're sort of following their own pride and trying to just crush anybody with the canons or the tradition, and that's an indication that they're not the spirit of God, and it's often like sort of an evil spirit behind them, I would say. So I guess that you could tell the different. It's one thing to be zealous about non-compromising, like let's say someone's introducing actual heresy, like Bartholomew or somebody else within the world Orthodoxy who's actually introducing these heresies, like the ecumenical movement, and standing up against that. It's a whole other thing, I guess, to want the world Orthodox damned to hell. Like that's not our purpose, I guess, is as true Orthodox. We're not here to necessarily condemn these people or like send fire from heaven down on them. We're trying to expose the delusion so maybe they come to the knowledge of the truth and change their ways. And that's with any group that we're dealing with. It's not that we in the church should hate these people in any way. If anything, we need to be as pastoral as possible. Uh, even in the face of persecution. Um, okay, so now this is the other topic I'm going to go to, and that was my first topic. This zeal not according to knowledge type thing. But let's see, what's up? Kalex, what's up, man? All right. And I think you might be into this machine. Like, this is something that I brought up on my last show. Um, this is something from Vladimir Moss, and it seemed pretty interesting. So we're gonna go there.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I was
Cool.
vibing with that last thing. Very important insights. Pride and knowledge and how it leads people astray, and they see themselves as representatives, you know, um, of God or of an ideology, instead of um, paying their dues to that, way of life. They try to attack, and that seems prideful, and you should hate the sin and not the sinner, and try to attack the problems in the world that the root causes of the societal ills, and not the people that are reflections of that.
Absolutely, and this is something. And since you actually went here, so I do have a little more on this, but it's like super correctness. That's what's like sort of it's been labeled, and now that designation has been used by the world Orthodox to paint all true Orthodox as that, as this super correct thing, like this zeal without knowledge. So it's becoming a weapon for them. When if you read, and now this is something that Father Seraphim Rose had written about in his letters, and when he's talking about this, he's not denouncing all the true Orthodox as being this. He was talking about a very specific group of people that, at this monastery in Boston, right? And what he had to say about Boston Orthodoxy was that he says this about them. He says, "We cannot follow the line of quote Boston Orthodoxy, which actually is a kind of reformed orthodoxy that happens to be mostly quote correct, but is actually outside the tradition of orthodoxy, a creation of human logic. It's a terrible temptation for our times, and most of the converts will probably be drawn into it. We fear that our articles about zealotry in the past years have helped to produce a monster. For the future, we will have to emphasize the quote feel of orthodoxy, without which zealotry is empty and even harmful." And he has another quote here. He says, "Sometimes one's zeal for orthodoxy can be so excessive that it produces a situation similar to that which that caused an old Russian woman to remark about an enthusiastic American convert. She says, 'Well, he's certainly Orthodox, all right, but is he a Christian?' To be Orthodox but not a Christian is a state that has a particular name in Christian language. It means to be a Pharisee, to be so bogged down in the letter of the church's laws that one loses the spirit that gives them life, the spirit of true Christianity." So sometimes what we'll see is people will quote the canons and the patristic text and all these different writings, and it's just that they're not actually quoting the spirit behind them. It's a caricature of the tradition, and that applies not only in the church. Like, you'll see that in other aspects of life where people want to manipulate whatever it is in their own favor. So they'll take a subject and they'll put it through their filter, you know and it becomes completely something else than it ever was, really. And it's a very subtle deception, I think, that is used by those that even in politics and other aspects. But I mean, it happens that way, and I've noticed it. And a good way to explain it is this quote too that I have from him, and this was a letter he wrote to a convert that had joined the Orthodox Church. And this convert was scandalized by something. I forget what it was. It was maybe they were venerating a saint that hadn't been formally canonized by the church yet. Maybe that was Saint Herman of Alaska, but they knew Saint Herman was a saint. And this new convert says, "Well, the church hasn't canonized this saint yet. Why are you venerating him?" You know, And this is a very new convert. So what he said to him, he said, "You trapped yourself in a satanic net of, quote, principles, which you are too cold and stupid to know how to apply, and yet you think yourself smart and worthy enough to do so. If your heart has responded to this that I have said, then return to us with tears and repentance that you fell away from unity with us through your accursed calculating logic, what is not at all based on, quote, principles, but on pride, and which does not at all join you to the mind of the church, but on the contrary separates you from it." But I've looked at it. I guess this ailment, it's like a spiritual disease. Uh, you know, the ailment is like a spiritual autism or something. Where everything's overly logical and overly literal, and it's what the Pharisees had going on. It's why they were cleaning the outside of the cup, yet the inside was filthy. And I see it within Protestantism too. A big thing with Protestants is like, they have all these principles that they think that they're upholding, and they don't realize, like, I don't know, like, let's take save for instance. It's like, oh, like, all I have to do is say that I'm saved and I am, like it's some magical formula. Well, they don't realize that Martin Luther was, involved in the Kabbalah, and that their tradition's only 150 years old or so, or whatever. And they want to throw out icons or any depiction of Christ, or the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And what's that rooted in? I think it's rooted in this very overly logical, and I think it developed out of the Enlightenment, like this Enlightenment type thought where everything has to be fit into a perfect box. If a scholar didn't say this miracle happened, then it didn't happen. If it's not documented, and this constant need for source after source kind of thing. We got Neurojack here, so I'm going to add him to the stage. Okay. All right.
Yeah, I got one for you.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a short one by Kierkegaard. He says, if
So,
someone who lives in the midst of Christianity enters with knowledge of the true idea of God, the house of God, the house of the true God, and prays, but prays in untruth. And if someone lives in an idolatrous land, but prays with all the passion of infinity, although his eyes resting upon the image of an idol, where then is there more truth? The one prays in truth to God, although he is worshiping an idol. The other prays in untruth to the true God, and is therefore therefore in truth worshiping an idol. So it kind of reminds me of what you said of the guy, of the lady who said somebody could be Orthodox but not a Christian.
right,
Right.
right.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because they turn the councils, and even like in the case of the Protestants, like it turned the Bible into an idol. It's like you're taking aspects of the tradition and you're pushing it through your own view, and it has nothing to do with what the thing is, or the tradition that you're actually involved in. The way I would kind of put it is, it's as if you were to go and study Chinese philosophy, right? And instead of going to the ancient Chinese philosophers or somebody in that tradition, you were to read the ancient Chinese philosophy and say, well, I think it means this. Would that be acceptable to your philosophy teacher? Or would he say, no, you need to interpret it the way it has been interpreted through the tradition? And it's almost as if, like, Christianity, and I'm not saying that we're the only ones that have to face this, but I've noticed this, especially in Christianity, where it's like, whatever it is that's coming, that where we're reading, we're depending on our own understanding of it instead of going to those who've been experts on the text. So instead of going to, the guy that lived 50 years out in the desert and studied it every single day, we're going to just base it off of how we understand the text. in our modern, viewpoint. And we're not even trying to put ourselves in the position of the people that wrote it, like trying to walk in their shoes in any way. It's just like, it's a big thing amongst the modernists, and not to keep rambling. They'll talk about like St. John Chrysostom and like how he would say that, the Jays were of the synagogue of Satan, or like whatever, right? He'd say things like that, and then they would say, well, obviously St. John was an anti-Semitic, right? And it's like, is he anti-Semitic or is he anti-heretic? And are you looking at the historical basis of why he's saying this, right? And it's like, no, you're just interpreting it from your modern perspective, and that's not the correct way to interpret his words and the words of tradition in general, I think. So it's a major problem. But
Well, I'll say a couple things really briefly.
okay, yeah, yeah.
There's a couple things. So, like, I will tell you, like, from my perspective, growing up as a Protestant, right? Like, I knew that what the Baptist Church was teaching was kind of like, delusional to some degree, right? So really, all I had was like basically like, you know, uh, prayer for basically the Holy Spirit to help me discern things, right? And so I think there's a lot of Christians who have this experience. Maybe not as many as we'd like, but there is some of that, right? And so I think some of this goes to where, like, it's kind of like I think Jesus has something to the effect of like, ask and you shall receive. And I think he's not. And there's a dangerous game here because it's not really like gnosis. It's not really knowledge. It's more of like discernment, right? So there's kind of a fine line between those two things, and I think those lines have been blurred quite a lot. And I think that's kind of what Crowley was talking about the great work, because you don't really need to create a cult that everybody joins. You need to create a mindset that everybody adopts, if that makes sense, right? And part of the problem that we find today is that we can't put ourselves. Yeah, sorry. So one part of the problem is that we find ourselves around all this technology and a lifestyle that has been imposed upon us that people should have been opposing a lot earlier, but they couldn't, or felt they didn't do the work when they could. Now we're in a situation where the lifestyle and the mindset and the situation that we're in is kind of like hard to get out of, right? Because the way we live is kind of impeding us interpreting those things the way that we should, because we can't. It's very
Right.
difficult to live our life in that way, right?
Right, sort of
Uh,
like there's three steps usually that and I'm not going to act like I've reached those steps. So I'm not necessarily the greatest person to probably go into detail about theology, and I'm like, no, I'm not giving my own opinions. If I do, I'm trying to give the opinions that from actual people that I think have reached that. And that's what I've brought forth so far. So what I'm saying is this is like, if we're not reaching for that stage of purification to get a point to discernment, and what I think a big problem is nowadays is people almost want to like logically deduct what the truth is first and then kind of join the church afterwards after they figured out who's had the least amount of problems. And what ends up happening is like you have an idealistic view, like people will have an idealistic view of the church because of that. They're like, what? Well, I mean, if you look back in church history, like the church has never been without problems. A part of the distinction between the church militant and the church triumphant is the church militant is going to deal with human passions and problems. It's not until we reach the kingdom of heaven that we're going to have the church triumphant where it's spotless, you know and there is no passions involved with that. What the problem is like you'll have people trying to treat the church trumpet as if it's on earth right now, and that's not the case. So they'll look for like whatever jurisdiction hasn't had any issues at all. And what that leads them into is like this sectarian mentality where they find themselves sort of like on their own and depending on their own logic and their own purity. And instead of saying like, okay, sometimes people, the intent of people isn't for, their intent isn't to do something wrong, and they make mistakes, and that's human, right? Instead of correlating a mistake instantly with a heresy, in an overlogical approach, like we shouldn't do that. And even when like Orthodox look at Protestants, some of them sincerely love Christ, right? And we should have a more pastoral approach to those people. They're not intently being heterodox Christians. They've just inherited this particular tradition and they believe it to be true, right? And aspects of it are true. And we need to recognize that as Orthodox Christians and not be so puffed up. Like a lot, I think, with the quote ortho bro movement, it's created Pharisees a lot of the times that get puffed up. They get like a little hint of the truth, and then they're like, I got the truth and nobody else does, and they're just kind of mean spirited or something, and it's easy to fall into. But there's a particular paper that I have here, and now this might scandalize some people, and I'm fine with that because whatever it is, what it is. Now it was written by Bishop Cyprian, who the majority of true Orthodox consider a heretic because of what he taught. Now, I think that aspects of his teaching are incorrect. But I'm not going to outright say the man was a heretic, but this particular paper, what he's talking about is a subject called supercorrectness. And this is before he kind of, I think, went overboard in his teaching, because I think he went almost too lax with it a little bit. And I could get into that later. But this is by Bishop Cyprian, Oropoulos and Philae, and this was in the Orthodox Word. And it's from the Orthodox Word, July through August 1980, and the edition is number 98. And it's kind of a short article. It's 3 pages long, something like that. And it says, "A word of warning to the Orthodox Christians of the West by Bishop Cyprian of Oropoulos and Philae of the Church of the True Orthodox Christians of Greece." And now this isn't like a full-on, just to clarify, this isn't me giving a full, I guess, shout out to what many would call Cyprianism. And I could go over that in a little bit as well. Okay, so I got somebody. I think he left. Okay, so he'll be back. But okay, so I'm going to go over this paper. It says, for over 50 years, the Orthodox Old Calendars of Greece have fought a courageous battle in the face of sometimes fierce persecution, and for the preservation of genuine orthodoxy against modernism and ecumenism. Unfortunately, their witness has to some extent been undermined by the presence among them of extreme views, which have caused unnecessary schisms. In the end, this extremism has only aided the cause of modernism, which rejoices at every division among those of traditional views. This temptation from the right side is now overly hasty accusations of, quote, heresy and, quote, betrayal, and the spread of the spirit of suspicion towards everyone not of one's own, quote, party. The present warning, in the form of a letter to the St. Herman Brotherhood from one of the most respected leaders of the Old Calendarist movement in Greece, is a most timely one. Bishop Cyprian is also abbot of the monastery of St. Cyprian and Justina of Philae near Athens, on which we see the Orthodox Word, 1976, number 70. And this is what Bishop Cyprian says to the St. Herman Brotherhood, which was Father Seraphim Rose and Father Herman. Pomazinski. So you have written asking me to put together a few words describing the dangers of the temptation of supercorrectness and question of the Orthodox faith and practice, and the damage it has caused to the Greek church in our days. This you would like as a warning to those in America who are troubled by the same temptation, and you would like them to benefit from our experience here. Very gladly, therefore, we will attempt to do this, emphasizing from the beginning that we have no wish to just criticize persons, but rather the mentality of extremism, the danger, the temptation, quote, from the right. We must begin with a few words on our confession of faith. The Orthodox Church is deeply wounded by the heresy of ecumenism, but the betrayal of the hierarchy in some communist lands, the abandonment of every vestige of Orthodox piety in some parts of the diaspora, and have now no doubt of the leaders of the ecumenical movement, and fully equating orthodoxy with heresy, have fallen away from the church. With such and those in communion with them, we have no communion at all, nor can we regard them any longer as orthodox, but wolves, all too often in sheep's clothing of patriarchs and bishops. Every witness of the fathers confirmed that economy in matters of heresy constitute betrayal. We regard the new calendar as the first step in the ecumenical movement, and thus have no communion with the new calendarists. From the above, the two questions arise. Firstly, have all those whom we have severed communion fallen into heresy and placed them outside the church? Secondly, if they have not, what justification do we have in cutting off prayerful relations with them? Both these questions require much thought. Insofar as the humanists are concerned, one can discern three categories. One, those who wholly equate orthodoxy with heresy and voluntarily places themselves outside the church in some sort of vague, quote, super church. Two, those who, while they are in no way negate their orthodoxy, nevertheless take part in joint prayer with heretics in transgression of the canons. We may perhaps call them anti-canonical rather than openly heretical. And three, those who, while they disagree to a greater or lesser extent with ecumenism, commune with the ecumenists, perhaps considering that they do so using economy. We pursuing the pursuit of the faith can have no communion of prayer with clergy who belong to these categories. But the vexed questions are, how are we to treat their flock? What degree of economy is permissible in our dealings with them? Which of the above clergy have definitively lost the grace of the priesthood through their apostasy? It is much the same question, so far as we know, which wrecked the catacomb church in Russia in its early years, and perhaps now. And it is disputes over these questions which have caused the greatest trouble among the old calendarists of Greece. These troubles we will summarize very briefly. In 1935, three bishops of the New Calendar Church of Greece returned to the observance of the old calendar and immediately consecrated four new bishops. The subsequent history of these does not concern us here, except for one, Bishop Matthew, a man of great personal virtues but extremist in temperament. In 1937, he separated himself from the other hierarchs, forming a schism which exists to the present day. The reason for his action was that the senior bishop, Metropolitan Chrysostomos, was asked in an interview if he considered that the state church had lost the grace of the sacraments in accepting the calendar innovation. He replied, no, only if your future council could condemn the new calendarists as definitely outside the church. But we know is that they are seriously guilty before the church, its canons and traditions, and therefore we can have no communion with them until such a time as they return to the traditions and discipline of the church. This truly orthodox ecclesiology, which can be paralleled particularly in St. Theodore the Studite, met with incomprehension on both sides. Both the new calendarists and a section of the old calendars condemned him as illogical. If they have grace, what justification exists for separation from them? As noted above, one of the newly consecrated bishops departed in a form schism which exists to this present day. We can only see this as the fruit of the mentality of, quote, overcorrectness, of a neglect of the economy which the Church requires to use for the salvation of souls. The damage caused to the Greek Church is immeasurable. For had this division not occurred, the state church of Greece would long have been obliged to return to the old calendar. We can cite other examples of, quote, overcorrectness from our experience. A fearful example is the following. A few years ago, a woman, unfortunately a nun, reading through the works of St. Notarius, the great wonder worker of our times, came across a few passages which she considered as not in accord with Orthodox teaching. A discerning mind would see that in these passages, the influence primarily of the westernized theological training which the saint received and of the historians of Perigalopolis, something like that, from whose book the passages are taken almost directly, and certainly no intentional contradiction of Orthodox teaching. The unfortunate nun, however, proceeded to write 3 books denouncing St. Nectarius as a, quote, heretic, iconoclast, ecumenist, and Latin. Simple people were influenced, many souls were wounded and scandalized. This fanatical mentality, as so often, had seized a detail while ignoring the whole. The exemplary and holy life of St. Nectarius and the innumerable miracles. Another example is provided for us by a group of persons who have severed all communion with all Orthodox in Greece because the hierarchs will not officially condemn as heretical the Western style icon of the Holy Trinity, with God the Father represented as an old man and the Holy Spirit as a dove. Neglecting everything else, they have seized on this detail and have been led into schism. Their struggle for the removal of the iconic type has become an obsession, a pre-lust, or a spiritual delusion, in other words. We should, however, in fairness, point out that these disputes have often been made worse by the opponents taking an equally fanatical position. Discretion is needed on both sides. It is also true that extremism among the old calendarists has been fostered by the savage persecution which the state church has launched from time to time. One of the most disastrous examples of the phenomenon which we are speaking is the disputes between the zealots of the Mount Athos, and many, to be sure, are clear-minded and sure of their purpose, but others waste so much time in useless disputes. In one and the same skete, one can find in each house a different ecclesiology, a different mentality, and not one in communion with their neighbor. They have seized on details, and all too often, in their lack of theological education, has seized on them incorrectly. Often their opinions are rational, but taken to extremes. Others, however, become very strange. One group believes that the name of Jesus shares in his divinity, and that all who do not believe so are heretics. Another, that those who practice frequent Holy Communion are heretics and excommunicate. Another has reached the old believer position that the grace of the priesthood has vanished from the church, and so forth. We must emphasize again that we have no wish to criticize persons. Many have a holiness which are never dare to hope to obtain. We only criticize that mentality which leads to division and schism. Now, to return to the question mentioned at the beginning, we would like to relate something which we observed recently. A few months ago, I visited Romania, and in one of the celebrated historical monasteries belonging naturally to the official church of Romania, was very kindly received by the abbot, a man of evident spiritual qualities and considerable education. He began to speak enthusiastically about the ecumenical movement and the reunion of the quote churches. To this I replied with such words as God enlightened me with, and I observed from his reaction that he had never before heard a point of view opposed to ecumenism. After the meeting, he told the Romanian bishop who was accompanying us that he had been much edified by the conversation. This gave me occasion for thought. It would be easy to condemn him immediately as an ecumenist and a heretic, but this was not the case. Despite his education, he had never given the matter deep thought, though certainly he should have done so. He had never heard any criticism of ecumenism. It never occurred to him that it was a denial of orthodoxy. To place him in the same category as, let us say, Militant of Chalcedon would be quite unjust. Perhaps it would be fair to use the same criteria to judge the faithful in the Soviet Union, who, with few exceptions, are obliged to have recourse to the Moscow Patriarchate. Are many faithful in outlying parts of Greece who had no conception of the calendar question. For every category, we must use discretion. It is impossible in all cases to apply the same strictness. While on the other hand, we must remember that economy used as a measure in itself becomes an abuse, and that in matters of heresy there can be no use of economy. In conclusion, we would say that the error of, quote, overcorrectness is a form of prelust, and like the other forms, this means a blindness, an obsession. The Holy Fathers say that prelust begins with self-reliance, and so while pursuing some probably very laudable particular end, the general picture becomes forgotten. There sets in a hardening of mind and heart, which results in disputes and fanaticism. The history of the church provides us with many examples, and most obviously the old believers of Russia. We hope that these words may help your American readers in understanding the mature orthodoxy which your publication always seeks to put forth. Okay. So that's the gist of like kind of what we're getting at. But I mean, I know there's a lot of people out there that have an issue with Cyprianism and they say they're heretics and all this other stuff. I would argue that there's a misreading amongst what we would call Cyprianites. So it's a seven ecumenical council that it would take a council to deem somebody graceless, which is not the case. Um, there was people that were deemed graceless prior to councils. We can look at Saint Hopatius with Nestorius. Prior to the Third Ecumenical Council, he says he was outside the church, and in that case, there was no need of a council to make that decision. In the same breath, I would say to hold a wrong opinion isn't necessarily a heresy. And I think it's actually rooted in an overcorrectness and playing party politics that people might come to those conclusions. I'll give you another example in history. We had Saint Justin Martyr, who put forth a millenarian view, like 1,000-year reign of Christ, or something, at the end of time or something. He had a false eschatology. Well, it wasn't until a council much later that that view was condemned as unorthodox. But someone like St. Justin Martyr wasn't condemned a heretic. And why? Because it had yet to be condemned as a teaching the church didn't accept. You also had Metropolitan Anthony Karpovitsky, who put forth the dogma of redemption. With dogma of redemption, it was like some false understanding of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Um, you know, some would say that I think there was people at that time who called him a heretic, and having a wrong opinion isn't a heresy. Now, if someone were to keep that wrong opinion after being corrected, it might fall into that over time, and especially if a council deems that this can't be decided. I don't believe we're going to have any more councils. So I would say that, I really don't know how to discern that issue because I don't have all the information on it. If someone were to tell me, like, this reason, this reason, this reason, this is the reason that the Cyprianites are heretics, I would listen to them. Right. And, but I would also listen to the other side of it. I'm not going to act like I have all the answers, but I know from just reading that paper from 1980 that doesn't sound like the position people say that they had. That seemed like a pretty sound, position to take about this overcorrectness issue. And I would say that in that same breath, some of those that take this overcorrectness issue, that doesn't necessarily make them outside of the church. It makes them outside of the tradition in some aspects. And I would think that, they should probably drop that pride, because we're all going to face Christ. I don't know how Christ is going to judge people individually, and I would think it's a mistake to think just whatever jurisdiction you were in guarantees you for salvation. That's not how any time in the church has worked. We're going to be judged individually based on what we did, not what jurisdiction we joined. So that's really what I've come to the conclusion of. So what? Are you still here, Machine?
Yeah.
So what do you think of that right there? Like, you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah. I mean, I've been listening and thinking about it. Yeah, definitely. The sort of nuanced approach is definitely necessary, right? Because of the way that people have an over technical analysis of things, right? They want to try something that works, right? So they're willing to put the church behind a party or an ideology because they think it's successful in dealing with the modern issues, right? So they'll transform the doctrine, right? So this is obviously a huge problem, and it's kind of like a Dunning-Kruger effect from having all the information at your fingertips at once. I mean,
Yeah.
So it's like, and not doing the sort of diligent work and really establishing how the people that thought of it came to that opinion. And then there's the overextension. I mean, as you said, of the economia principle with the Cyprianism. So it's a very nuanced approach. I mean, it's very interesting.
Absolutely. It's a trip because we have we'll have a lot of like, I'm not like, kind of attacking these guys, but there's like maybe a large group of that call themselves true Orthodox, and they kind of frequent different places, right, on the internet or whatever, and they fall into some of these mindsets. And I'm not going to act like I'm above them or something like that, because I'm not. And some of them I have a lot of respect for, but I see this mentality sometimes amongst them, and it kind of spreads out. And then you'll have people that kind of fall into these traps, and they don't think about it, and they think that they're being zealous for orthodoxy. And and like what you're saying, that you'll have guys that will quote the canons and they'll quote the patristic text, but they're not relaying the spirit of them. They're creating a caricature of these texts. And what ends up happening is that in their zeal, they find themselves actually outside of the tradition and bringing in some sort of reform mentality that's rooted in this, I guess, spiritual autism. And that's the way I look at it. And what it takes is God kind of avoids the proud and gives grace to those that humble themselves. And what it takes is prayer and praying for discernment and putting ourselves under obedience to spiritual fathers that can guide us through these kind of hang-ups, you know, instead of relying on our own, logic, or going to the saints and trying to discern exactly where the correct approach is and how we should view these particular texts or whatever it may be. um it's a it's a it's one of the chief problems facing the church today, um both from the right and the left, I would say. And if we're going to take the narrow path as Christians, we have to be aware of what sort of traps are laid out for us by either the demons or our own just regular passions, our own flesh, our own issues, and when we're not judging things righteously. And hopefully that like someone has taken something away from this and can and learn from it. That's really the intent of what I'm doing here. Um, and as far as this guy here goes, I know who you are, man. That I'm not even gonna say anything. You can keep going at it, man. Uh
Yeah, you got a comment there by Frey.
okay, what was Frey got to say? Sometimes the amount of information on the subject is a bit overwhelming as to where to start the actual research reading. I often get discouraged. Huh. Now, what do you necessarily are you talking about, Frey? Is like the information on the royal path, or like super correctness, or um? I'll tell you this: to be
Yeah, because
aware of.
that's kind of what you're getting into, is that you don't need all the information, and even when you have all the information, don't apply it in the wrong way.
Right. I think, yeah, sometimes it's almost like information overload. And I would go into the tradition the way that you're supposed to, like getting catechized, go to the church, get catechized, have a spiritual father. Don't try to figure it all out on your own, because you're not going to be able to. And a simple prayer, sometimes I would say that God will guide you if you humble yourself, and he'll lead you down the right path if you put your trust in him. He'll do it. Um, with the royal path specifically, here's a warning I'll tell you about. You'll find from world orthodoxy that they'll shift the royal path, that they'll make all true Orthodox seem like they're renovationists on the right. Okay? And that's to basically, you'll see it with Father Peter Harris. He'll make it out like all old calendarists are super correct. Well, that's not, the person that coined this term, Father Seraphim Rose, never said all old calendars were super correct. He was talking about HTM specifically, and that's Holy Trinity Monastery. That was Boston Orthodoxy with a Father Pantalone. Father Pantalone, Father Pantalone was a monk from Detroit that put on a Greek accent and went to Greece, stayed there for a month with some of the monks there, right? And he was, the spiritual student of, uh, of some say Saint Joseph the Cave Dweller, or Father Joseph the Cave Dweller, or Elder Joseph the Cave Dweller, whatever you want to call him. He was a spiritual student of him. Well, he stayed there a monk in his, I think it was in his 30s. He was starting to call himself an elder. Well, he really didn't pick up Orthodox tradition from the elders in a very solid way. He had kind of a neo-Athonite understanding of things, and then got introduced to some true Orthodox thought, and then he kind of gave his own approach on it that fell into this overcorrectness type thing. And it wasn't it wasn't the tradition really of Orthodoxy. If you want to learn about true Orthodoxy, I would go to Archbishop of Urki. I would go to St. Philaret of New York. I would go to Seraphim Rose. I would go to St. John Maximovich. And I'm not just saying the Russians were the only ones right. You could go to St. Nectarius of Aegina. You could go to St. Hieronymus of Aegina, St. John of Amenphali. Like, there's different saints among the Greeks as well. Um, I don't know. I would just take it slow and try to discern the spirit of what you're reading. And a good way to go about that is to pray about it for humility and not to be led astray. And don't give in to being scandalized. Okay, so I'm baptized Orthodox. I'm under a spiritual father who is in Rocor MP. Says Seraphim Rose is ruled despite Seraphim Rose being the spiritual father of previous priest of the parish. Well, I would say that's rooted in, if you know what happened to Rocor MP in 2007, the KGB had infiltrated Rocor. They caused a capitulation. They caused Rocor to sort of give up on all the ideals of old Rocor, which was the true Rocor. And so he has to say that about Father Seraphim Rose. He's deluded in truth.
Yeah.
And
Actually, Deaths to Compromise exposed how some of their priests actually defend the censoring of works of Seraphim Rose.
yeah, and
The higher
he's on the same line. So there's a book called High Treason. I've got the video High Treason on my account. You can watch that. There's an article by Orthodox traditionalists. I would read High Treason. I would say, Fred, look, you might not share the opinion of your spiritual father, but if he's the one guiding you in the Orthodox Church, your opinions don't purify him. Your spiritual father's supposed to guide you. There's a hierarchy here. So if your metropolitan is guiding the bishops, and the bishops are guiding your priests, and there's a link off in this golden chain, something's wrong, right? And I'm not saying that everybody has to be perfect, but you definitely don't want to follow somebody in heresy. Because if you're following someone in heresy, that means, I hate to break it to you, but you're in heresy. And that's what St. Theodore the Studite says. And I'll read you a quote from St. Theodore the Studite just to show you what I mean. This is what St. Theodore says. He says, and this was in the 9th century, he says, regarding the faith, the heretics were utterly shipwrecked. But concerning the others, if even in their thinking they did not founder, nevertheless, on account of their communion with heresy, they too were destroyed alongside the others. Now, this was Epistle 15 to the Patriarch of Jerusalem. I would say this, is that you're not in limbo. You can contact a true Orthodox priest, and you can start doing the typica. It's better to not receive sacraments from a heretic than receive no sacraments at all. I mean, it's better to not receive sacraments at all than receive them from a heretic. That's what I would tell you. I mean, I built cells at the Cobble Skill. I help them build cells. I think they're good. I think they're discerning. I think they're good. If you can get there, I would go there. Absolutely. Good. That's good. That's a start, and I would say just let him guide you. And hopefully you can get involved with the GOCK or any other true Orthodox that's available. That's definitely a better start than being in Rocor MP, where a guy is saying a saint's in prelest because he went along with a KGB capitulation. That's crazy. But yeah, that's and there's probably a lot of people that are can be scandalized about some of the things we talk about. But I mean, Frey, if you go through that book, I promise you, go through High Treason, and you look through some of the videos that I posted, go to Orthodox Traditionalist publications, like that's a big one because Subdeacon Nectarius, he came from Rocor MP. He knows the struggle. He knows exactly what you're going through, and he's in the GOCK now. That would be a big person to maybe reach out to if you could, or just go through his stuff, like his material. Like he's released a lot of good material on that specific issue. There's a lot of stuff there. I mean, I don't know if you reach out to me. I have an email address. Reach out to my email address, and I can give you more solid information to go over as well. So you're not stuck sort of in this limbo phase, because nobody wants to be like that. Pray to God for discernment on it too. Like if you're not sure, don't trust me. Ask God, because I had to ask God. Not that I came from World Orthodoxy. I had prayed prior to even going into any Orthodox church, where was the church, and I got led to a true Orthodox church. So High Treason. I don't. It's by an Olga something. I forget her last name. But High Treason. You can find. You can find I'll send you a copy of it for one if you email me. But you could find a video I did on it, and I think in the description, I have Subdeacon Nectarius's website where he actually posts the digital copy of it, so you'll get that. Um, okay, so let's talk about this, Retro Gamer. All right. So in the gospel, we read about Philip, and when Philip's out in the desert, he walks out into the desert and he finds an Ethiopian in his carriage, and the Ethiopian is reading the book of Isaiah, right? So let's go to that real quick. Let's see what happened in that circumstance. Philip and the Ethiopian. All right. All right. This is what it says. This is in Acts 26 through 40. Philip and the Ethiopian. Now, an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Go south to the road in the desert, road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza." So he started out on his way and he met an Ethiopian, the eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasury of the Kandake, which means Queen of the Ethiopians. This man had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and on his way home was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit told Philip, "Go to that chariot and stay near it." Then Philip ran over to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. And he says, quote, "Do you understand what you're reading?" Philip asked. And this is verse 31. And this is what the Ethiopian says. He says, "How can I?" he said. Quote, "Unless someone explains it to me." So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. He says, this is the passage of the scripture the eunuch was reading. Quote, "He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearers is silent, so did he not open his mouth. And in his humiliation he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of descendants? For his life was taken from the earth." The eunuch asked Philip, quote, "Tell me, please, who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else?" Then Philip began with that very passage of the scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. As they traveled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What stand in the way of me being baptized?" And he gave orders to stop the chariot. Then both Philip and the eunuch went down into the water, and Philip baptized them. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord suddenly took Philip away, and the eunuch did not see him again, but went on his way rejoicing. Philip, however, appeared at Azotus and traveled about, preaching the gospel in all the towns where he reached Caesarea. So, in other words, we're going to have this mentality of why talk to a man. What if the eunuch would have had that mentality towards Philip? What if he would have said to Philip, "You're a man. I don't need you to teach me the book of Isaiah. I can read it myself." He didn't do that, did he? He said, what did he say? What did he say again? All right, let's go to it one more time. So the exact words the Ethiopian said to Philip, he said, "How can I unless someone explains it to me?" All right. That's the mentality we should have. We should humble ourselves enough that if someone is in the tradition of the church and has been handed down the gospel and handed down the proper way to go about baptism and giving the sacraments of eating the body and blood of Christ, which Christ says, if you don't do this, you have no life in you. Why wouldn't we go about it the way that it's always been gone about for the last 2,000 years? Why would we depend on our own thinking on that? So that's my view on it. And it's not the miracle that converted the Ethiopian. The fact that uh, Philip was taken away by the Spirit of God, he disappeared in thin air. It was something, his heart was hardened, and something changed his heart in that moment. And I believe if you look into this, God's revelation is revealed to the heart, the human heart, through through grace. Um, but well, here's the thing. It's like if why did Christ have 12 apostles? And then why do you have someone like Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who's a direct disciple of Saint John, who wrote Revelation, and Saint, Peter, and he says, "Follow the bishop as you would follow Christ." Because Christ set up the apostles, and he set up those that would follow them to be overseers of the church. And these priests were the ones who would ordain people and give them the sacraments and baptize them. This is, Christ had established a church. He didn't just write down a book and give it to us or something like this. The Bible itself wasn't even really put in place until 300. The church it had been functioning up until that point, and the Bible isn't outside of the tradition. It's a part of it. It's just one part of it. And I would say with enough humility, you could find your way into the church as well if you pray about it and drop the pride where you think you can do it on your own. But I appreciate everybody for stopping by. I'm gonna go. I appreciate you, Machine, for sticking by, man. And
Yeah, thank you, my friend. Yeah, anytime. Man.
yeah, are you doing a show tonight, or what's going on?
No, it's Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday.
Okay.
We'll keep it to the usual times this week. Yeah, blessings. Yeah,
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll stop by when you have one.
for
So,
sure, for sure. I look
wait,
forward to it.
hold up. I got Neurojack in the back. I'll bring him up on. Okay, I'm gonna have him to the stage. Maybe might go over something.
Yeah, you guys are about to end now?
Well, I was thinking about it, but I mean, maybe not. What's going on?
Yeah, sorry, it's been a weird time. The timing is weird for me. So, but yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, just going off of what I was going on earlier. I mean, um, I think that's why people are having a hard time discerning, and I didn't hear I didn't hear the what happened after I left, but I think that's kind of I mean, that's the main reason why uh, there's a lot of people taking advantage of the schisms and heresies and all these other things going on with Christianity, because it's convenient it's easy to exploit, right? And so the devil's going to do that, obviously.
Right. He wants to create layers to where it's like you can't discern what path to take to get there, right? And I mean, if you're a devil and you're cast out of heaven, like you're not able to have that anymore. You want to make sure everybody else that has that possibility um, doesn't get there. And how do you do that? You fill them full of pride. And if Satan was cast out for just having pride, this was his one sin. Why do people think they're going to enter with pride the kingdom of
Well,
heaven?
and think about it like this. Like, I don't want to equate humans to dogs, but let's just use the analogy for the moment, right? Like, if you get a dog and you neglect him and you beat him and that's his experience of the world around him, right? Like, let's just say of like his father or his master or whatever, right? And then you turn that dog out on the loose and he has the ability to go and inflict that on other people, and then he feels like, I'm winning in the game of life, right? You can't really blame the dog. That's just his perspective, right? You know what I mean? And I think the difference with humans is that you blame the sin, which is like pride, abuse, all these things, but at the same time, like, you have to try to help people walk through it. And so, this idea of like modern psychology, of like therapy and all these things are like they're kind of like pseudo they're kind of like pseudo therapy or something, right? I mean pseudo theosis or something, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that in a lot of ways we get overwhelmed by these things, and they can be used for the good. I don't want it like a direct denunciation of, that's not my approach. At least I think in aspects in moderation, everything can be used for in some sort of good can come out of it. Like for instance, with Frey, like Frey can hit up my email and like I can give him some material that might be helpful to him, right? And I wouldn't have that opportunity otherwise, right? Like not as easy to kind of reach out and have some ability to I guess share information, but I mean there's always the downside to that too, you know. That's with anything, right? If it's not approached properly. And that, but I mean there is a fear kind of with like um I get like take AI for instance. Like once you open Pandora's box, you can't put it back in, and we think we can sort of like moderate this thing, but in time, how is it going to get out of control to where we can't control it? And I would say probably yes. You know what I mean? Like it's going to go out of control. Uh, um, but I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I think it goes back to what you're saying at the beginning is like it's not even like even the idea of control is kind of like a misnomer in a sense because like and that's kind of and the reason I say that is like if you think about like what you started off with like trying to put ourselves like in the shoes of like early Christians or something, right? Like the way we live is kind of determined by the environment and the people and the technology and all these other like milieus or whatever you want to call it around us, right? So it's like, how do you really, you kind of like don't have control of that. I mean, you can maybe mitigate it somewhat or try to like become more ascetic or control certain things about yourself, and it'll help to some degree, but you're never going to be able to put yourself fully into
I don't
those
think it's
times.
necessarily needed to go fully. I think if we can just hang on to being orthodox, you know, to the degree that we can, that's enough. You know, because we're facing a different type of martyrdom that than the early Christians did. You know, ours is more mental rather than physical, and I think that struggle is given for our salvation in a lot of ways, and that if we can just find our way into the church and we can find our way into maybe upholding the fast, and it doesn't mean that when we fall we can't get back up. It's like to fall is expected. To stay down is the demonic aspect of it, or to not try at all. It's like we're
Right.
trying to work with what we have and do the
Right.
best with what we have.
And in a lot of ways, this is why I say that like like you, and I know you've said this, and I'm sure other people said it. Like before we had to worry about like war and being ruled by rulers and stuff like that. Now it's a little more subtle because we kind of we have more freedom, quote unquote, in some senses, right? But we have less, like almost like the fact, like kind of like the machine says, like the rights, RITE, or AKA duties, have been kind of stripped away from us, and so instead we get rights, which is like freedom too, in a sense, right? So like that kind of thing is not really something that
Well, we have so
existed
much
before, you know.
freedom now that the freedom that we're offered has become a form of slavery, right? And that it's a subtle type thing. And I think Huxley talked about it is like that our toaster ovens and our technologies would eventually enslave us. And there's something like in Fight Club where it sort of like touches on that aspect of like what we're kind of talking about now is where it's like the idealistic view of what we're supposed to be can somehow enslave us in some way, or I don't know. But there was a Metropolitan Demetrius said something really interesting one time. He said that, the church is deprogramming us from the program that society is trying to put on us. And Father Seraphim Rose said something, and it's like what society's trying to program with us is this atheistic nihilism, right? It's being pounded on us on every side of culture, is like, give up on God, don't pray, don't try, everything is doomed. Like, and that's Satan's doing, man. Satan wants us in a state to where we feel there's no way out. And it's just not true. It's a lie. You know what I mean? Just, if we had faith of a mustard seed, then we would be able to go in the direction, uh, you know, some form of direction for the better in some sense. But we just don't see that because we're so bogged down by this gloom and doom, and that's very strategic. I'd say, and a big problem is like our conceptions of things like are just a little bit off. For example, like if we're talking about God or something, some people view God as like this evil, like angry God or something. Like I believe Protestantism almost has that conception of God as like he's this angry God that wants to damn everybody to hell. That's not how he is. That's a false conception of him. That's an idol almost, right? And you know God's looking for any little thing of our giving up on our own, I guess, passions and moving towards him, whereas man, he's looking for anything to condemn us. God's not the one who's like that, you know what I mean? And I think that the more we would sort of study the lives of saints, which have, I think it's very strategic that within Protestantism that has been a major rejection, but I don't know. I guess he fell out.
Yeah, and there's an increased sense in today, that obviously, technology and science and materialism, they've deformed the religious outlook. And I guess there's a lot of, it's like ecofeminism versus authoritarianism. It's basically the spiritual, struggle of
Yeah,
today. And that's a sad reality. And the detached aspect of it comes from the fact that most people don't incorporate the rites and traditions into their daily practice. Is that
right.
their life isn't molded around the religion, it's a backdrop. And without practice, in terms of getting the daily, sort of emptying yourself and trying to discover new aspects of the faith, there's no actual progression. Because there's 100 things. Just one billboard can change your entire day. We have images that are, imposed on us. And
Right.
they take up space in our head. And yeah, we have to be active in terms of, trying to combat that with the icons and all that type of stuff. And right,
Yeah, that's
it has to be a daily. You have to surround yourself with these things because otherwise, all these false images are gonna, pervade, you know, everyday life.
absolutely, and that's actually what they were. The intent of having them is, and if we're like I'm telling you, like this mentality that it's like, well, in our modern day, what are we supposed to do? Like, well, as long as we're thinking like that, it will be impossible. It's like you kind of like speak, you know, you either give life to what you want to give life to, I guess, right? It's something like that, and I don't know. We it's like if we're going to look at everything like it's gloom and doom, it's going to be that way. But if we actually stand up and say, I'm not going to allow this to influence my thinking, I'm going to take steps to go in this other direction. I'm going to, really rebel against this, what the secular world is pushing onto me. Um, you know, so, but a lot of times I think another aspect of this zeal not according to knowledge is almost like allowing, and this is a big lesson that I had to learn when I first came into the church, is like allowing other people maybe to scandalize me to take me out of the church. If someone can say something to you or do something to you that is going to take you out of the church, you didn't deserve to be there in the first place. Like, what uh, it's like, they're every where, the church is sort of a place full of sick people, and Christ is the physician. You wouldn't be in a hospital and you wouldn't like point around and say, I'm less sick than you are in a hospital full of sick people. But that's oftentimes what we'll see within the church. It's like, well, this person did this or that, and I'm not going to church anymore because of that, or whatever it is. Like, we'll find kind of any excuse to give up when it comes to God, because we've turned him sort of into this constitutional monarch where we only worship him on Sundays. That's the kind of religion American society pushes. Um, Whereas, what the saints say, it's like, if you aren't Orthodox every minute of your life, you're not Orthodox at all. you know but that's not the I guess the modern Christian so-called outlook on religion. It's like, we'll go for 30 minutes for a service and then we'll call ourselves Christians, and after that, you might cry during a service where they're playing guitars or something, and maybe drink a juice box with some crackers, and that's Holy Communion for you, and then you leave out of there and you're right back to, I don't know, smoking a blunt or something. That's not being a Christian. Like, it's just not. I mean, hate to say it, but uh, yeah, I appreciate you again.
Yeah,
I'm
for
gonna
sure.
thank you for having thank whatever. Okay, I thank you, man. Later.
Bless you, bro. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, hey, bro.